Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Kathleen Murphy from the American Institute for Research, or AIR. I'll be moderating today's webcast, which is entitled Research to Practice in the NIDILRR Community. The webcast is offered through the Center on Knowledge Translation for Employment Research, which is known as KTER. KTER is funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, and we call it NIDILRR. I also want to thank my colleague Ann Outlaw, who has really done a lot of hard work on this webcast, and we really appreciate all her effort. Before we get going, I do have a reminder for all participants. There are materials accompanying today's event that you can find on the web page advertising the webcast. So the presentation is there as a PDF file of the slides. There's also a text version. Some of the slides on the computer screen can be small, so having that actual file or printout might be helpful. If you haven't already downloaded the materials, go back to that confirmation email you got, look for the title of today's webcast, and you can click on that. Then scroll down the web page that pulls up, and you'll see where you can download the materials there. So just as another reminder, all the materials are copyrighted. If you want to use the information, you would need to first contact the particular presenter to ask permission. At the end, we appreciate your feedback. There will be a really brief evaluation form, and I will remind you at that time about that. Okay, so we're going to move into the meat of our presentation. And before we start talking about these three NIDILRR Research to Practice projects, I thought you might want some context about the KTER Center itself. Next slide, please, Ann. Our mission is to promote the use of employment research findings to improve both practices and policies that support improved employment outcomes of individuals with disabilities. Next slide, Ann. More specifically, our goals are increased understanding of practices that might lead to successful KT in the field of employment for individuals with disabilities. And so we want increased adoption and use of relevant research findings, particularly those funded by NIDILRR, but other entities as well, that might improve the employment of individuals with disabilities. And we also want to increase the capacity of NIDILRR's employment-focused grantees to plan and engage in their own KT activities. Next slide, please. So how we aim to achieve our mission is working with those employment-focused NIDILRR grantees. They can help us identify research findings that might be used to improve employment outcomes for individuals with disabilities. We also want to figure out, well, what do stakeholders really need? What are their research-based knowledge needs that are most pressing? And then we are positioned to investigate and promote effective strategies that might increase the appropriate use of the best available knowledge in the field. Now, today's webcast is most related to that third domain. We always, in planning and conducting all of our activities, KTER collaborates with relevant partners, other researchers, key stakeholders in the field of disability and employment research. So the PIs and staff of these new NIDILRR projects for the translation of disability and rehabilitation research into practice, boy, that's a mouthful, they were just a natural fit. So today we're going to hear from all three of these new awards. Next slide, they're listed. These are DRIPs, they're Disability and Rehabilitation Research Projects, and I already told you their official title. There are three of them. One of them that we're going to hear from first in a minute is translating evidence about traumatic brain injury to practice within the Washington State Department of Corrections, which sometimes people call the DOC. We'll hear from Mark Harness from that award. After Mark is done, Lynn Warraby is going to explain what is going on with the project Translating Transfer Training and Wheelchair Maintenance into Practice. Then finally, to wrap up, we'll hear from Marsha Langer Ellison, who will be talking about TEST, which stands for Translating Evidence to Support Transitions. And their title goes on to explain that they will be improving outcomes of youth in transition with psychiatric disabilities by use and adoption of best practice transition planning. So as I mentioned, first up is Mark Harness.
All right. Thank you, Kathleen. Really appreciate the introduction and very excited to present our new KT project. So first, I'd like to just acknowledge my colleagues who are working on the project, Becky Matter, Sherry Brown, Kurt Johnson, and NIDILRR, all from the University of Washington. And I thought I'd start with a bit of an overview about TBI and then talk about TBI and corrections before we talk about the specific activities that would be part of this project. This audience is probably familiar with issues that face people with TBI and are aware that TBI is a serious health concern. We know that there are at least 1.7 million people who sustain a TBI annually in the United States, and we know that of those, about 52,000 die, 275,000 are hospitalized, and about 1.5 million are treated and released from emergency departments. A recent meta-analysis by Frost and his colleagues estimated that about 12% of adults in the general population had a history of TBI with loss of consciousness. And they also found that men have twice the odds of having a TBI compared to women. And finally, we know that people with TBI as a result of intentional injuries, meaning injuries that could be crime-related like assault, are more likely to be male, they're more likely to be younger, unemployed, living alone, and to have greater challenges related to alcohol and drug abuse. They also tend to show poor functional gains after discharge from hospital and tend to be less likely to be discharged home. TBI has an impact on all areas of major areas of functioning, including cognitive executive functions like planning and memory, social cognition, social functioning and motivation. And depending on the severity of injury, these impairments may lead to deficits that can hinder or prevent the injured person from resuming activities of everyday life. We also know that deficits in executive function are often barriers to participation in all areas of life, including employment and education, and they lead to reduced participation, economic marginalization, lower reported quality of life. In our own work, we found that participants with TBI often report significant needs for support across a number of categories that are related to cognition. And those can include remembering to take daily medication, keeping appointments, keeping a daily schedule, time management, initiating activities, and so on. And then from an emotional and behavioral perspective, we know that TBI is associated with mood and anxiety disorders, including depression, mania, PTSD, and there's some evidence that people with TBI may also have an increased probability of social isolation. So what happens when people with TBI are incarcerated, when they connect to the Department of Corrections? Well, first let's talk about how many people in prison have a TBI. The prevalence of TBI, we know, is significantly higher in the population of incarcerated offenders than it is in the general adult population. And there was a recent study by Phillips that was conducted in the Washington State Department of Correction. Their estimate was that 35.6% of offenders in the Washington State DOC have a history of TBI, and of those, 7.6% have moderate to severe TBI. A couple of recent meta-analyses have estimated even higher rates, as high as 51 to 60% of the incarcerated population having experienced a TBI. So what do we know about people with TBI who enter the correction system? Well, the general risk factors for arrest appear to be similar between people with TBI and those without TBI. So in general, young, single, less educated males are more likely to be arrested. It's also true that a history of offending prior to the TBI is associated with a post-TBI arrest. In other words, it's likely that individuals have a history of offending before they have their first TBI. However, researchers have noted one important difference, and that is that there is a stronger relationship between having a TBI and substance abuse challenges for offenders, for people with TBI, than for those without. And in the DOC study I mentioned, they found a very high number of offenders, 95.2%, had a history of chemical dependency issues in comparison to 60.5% of the general population. And in addition, there is also some evidence that suggests that it may be more common for offenders to have experienced multiple TBIs. And I should just note before I move on, I know that some people are uncomfortable with that word offenders, but that is the word used in the Department of Corrections, and so that's the word that we've adopted in our project for now. So what happens to people with TBI when they are in corrections? There's not a lot of research, but what there is suggests that these individuals have higher rates of recidivism. That means that they have multiple incarcerations than offenders without TBI. They tend to be much heavier users of medical and psychological services. They appear to be less able to maintain rule-abiding behavior, which is important within a correctional facility, and they're less likely to complete chemical dependency programs. And so clearly some issues that are unique to people with TBI in correctional settings. There's not much known about what frontline correctional staff know or don't know about TBI, but in our interactions with the Washington State DOC, we've heard that what people have said a couple of times is that they know about as much as they learn from the news. And so there's not focused programming related to traumatic brain injury in DOC, and frontline staff probably have a fairly limited understanding. So let's talk about our project. We have engaged in a collaboration with the Washington State Department of Corrections with the goal of translating research findings and products on TBI into practice. And this collaboration part is really critical to this project. DOC is a complex and very large organization, state organization, and we would not have much success trying to develop trainings or to engage in knowledge translation activities if we didn't have a really strong relationship with staff inside of the DOC. They've already been extremely helpful, just helping us to understand how DOC works and what kinds of things might be feasible, and to understand the culture of the DOC, of the Department of Corrections. So the collaboration is pretty critical to the project. And again, we're going to focus in this project on frontline staff, so prison staff, community correction officers who work regularly with offenders with TBI. As many of the viewers probably know, this KT grant required that we jump off from a NIDILRR product that had been previously developed, and we are jumping off from the TBI consumer fact sheets that were developed as part of the UW Model System Knowledge Translation Center that ran several years ago. And so some of the fact sheets are listed there, and you can find those online. So our goal is to really work to improve management or interactions with offenders with TBI by frontline staff. And so our objectives include helping frontline staff understand what is a TBI, how offenders might be affected by TBIs, what can they do, the frontline staff, that would help in day-to-day management of problems faced by offenders with TBI, including memory, communication, mood, impulsivity, to understand how TBI might affect engagement in treatment programs, how it might affect compliance with DOC rules and regulations, and how it might affect transition from corrections to community living. Our project was designed to build across 5 phases, but we really designed it more as a process than as a very clearly defined set of steps. And that's because we feel strongly that the development of the KT plan, all of that work is going to be an interactive process with DOC. And so in this first year, a big part of what we're doing is matching evidence to gaps. In other words, we're trying to understand what we know in terms of evidence about TBI and corrections, and to look into the DOC and to communicate with staff in the DOC to understand what they know about TBI as well, and to identify the really critical points of intervention, the gaps where we might do some work. We're also in this first year going to work with the DOC to develop and implement a KT plan, a knowledge translation plan, and out of that will come activities that will begin this year and will continue through the 5 years of the project, and I'll talk a little bit more about those later. There's a strong project evaluation component, but it's also wrapped inside a process evaluation. So we think an important outcome from our project will be an understanding of the process of working within the DOC, understanding the facilitators and barriers that we experience as we attempt to do this work, and to be able to document that so that we can share it with other people who may want to do this kind of work. And then finally, of course, dissemination. Our goals will be to increase the use and adoption of research-based findings within DOC and to change, hopefully find changes in policy, practice, or systems that improve the lives of offenders with TBI within the DOC. And then finally, an increased understanding of promising KT practices within the criminal justice community more broadly. I'm going to jump forward and just share some sense of how we intended to roll it out or how we propose to roll it out, with the caveat that it may change based on our work with the DOC. But the big idea was that out of our knowledge translation planning, we would likely come up with a couple tracks that we would begin to roll out. The first track is really more system-wide knowledge translation intervention that will help increase knowledge of frontline staff, and that was intended to be something we do in years 1 and 2, where we first integrate introductory TBI evidence into existing curriculum and programming, and then later focus on more intermediate and advanced TBI information. And then in the second part of the project, we hope to implement an intensive KT pilot intervention in probably one primary facility, and we haven't firmly decided where that will be, but there are veterans pods, they're called, so areas in the DOC where only veterans are incarcerated. There's a women's prison, and there's also an area called Cedar Hall, and it is an area that focuses on individuals with developmental disabilities and moderate to severe TBI. So we'll be identifying a target population and implementing a KT intervention that will be defined with DOC staff, but will focus on helping those staff understand and implement practices that improve the interaction with offenders with TBI. And so that's our project. Here's our project contact information. If you have any questions, feel free to email or to take a look at the website. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much, Mark. That sounds like a very important but absolutely challenging project given its setting. So we'll be interested to learn more about it as it unfolds. Okay. You all set, Lynn? Okay, take it away.
Okay, so I'm excited to share with you guys some information about our project on translating transfer training and wheelchair maintenance into practice. I'm going to start with a little background on sort of how this came to be. So there are about 3.3 million wheelchair users in the United States, and they represent a pretty extensive range of disability groups, including spinal cord injury, multiple sclerosis, to those with spina bifida and lower limb amputations. And it's believed that the wheelchair is likely the single most enabling technology a clinician can provide. It provides the user access to the community, it can increase participation, and it can also positively impact quality of life. Unfortunately, this impact is compromised when it can't be used secondary to pain or injury in the user's upper limbs, or if the wheelchair itself isn't working. So it's necessary that we sort of move forward and find ways to maximize these enabling benefits that this technology is able to provide, while also minimizing secondary conditions associated with wheelchair use. So the University of Pittsburgh has looked at a lot of different aspects of wheelchair technology, but two areas of focus for us have been wheelchair failures and prevention of arm pain related to overuse, and that's sort of where this project comes into play. So in terms of transfers, mastering the skill is a pretty important milestone of rehabilitation among wheelchair users. Despite this, as few as about 20% of individuals with spinal cord injury report the ability to independently perform a transfer upon discharge. They're a pretty important part of daily life. Users transfer on high repetition increases the risk for resulting overuse injuries. And then there's pretty much a lack of skill and training and a need for us to sort of fill that void and provide that training. At the same time, proper wheelchair functioning is critical to participation and quality of life. Unfortunately, we found that the prevalence of wheelchair failures has been increasing in past years. It exceeds over 50% in some studies currently. The biggest problem with these failures is the adverse consequences that they bring. So things like injuries, missed school and work, and missed medical appointments can all happen as a result of your wheelchair not working. Poorly maintained chairs have been tied to an increased risk of breakdown, injuries, and also greater cost of care. Despite the fact that regular maintenance has been shown to decrease adverse consequences without interventions, it appears that users don't perform maintenance regularly. Maintenance is also not a common topic in curriculums among clinicians related to wheelchairs. So we find that there's a general need to increase the number of users, clinicians, family members, and caregivers that are receiving training in maintenance to prevent some of these adverse consequences that can happen. So to date, the University of Pittsburgh has been running some in-person training programs in the areas of both transfers and maintenance. These programs have led to individuals using less harmful positions, decreasing the loading on their joints, and completing maintenance tasks. Unfortunately, there are several barriers to the implementation and sustainability of this type of program on a broader spectrum. So in order for this intervention to be successful, a user needs to have access to a trainer that has content knowledge, that's also available and able to be in the same physical location as the trainee at a time that's conducive for both of them. And then in a clinical model that sort of also necessitates that the trainer can bill for these services or they have to provide their time without compensation. So the goal of this project is to sort of combine the strengths of the University of Pittsburgh and the American Institutes for Research in both content knowledge, instructional course development, and dissemination to develop some web-based versions of these training materials that are accessible and self-paced and sort of get us over some of the barriers of in-person training. And then the goal of this is that we'll be able to impact our audience by increasing awareness of the increasing understanding, and then eliciting a change in behavior among wheelchair users. So we'll go through the specific aims of the study next. And the first is really focused on refining some of the high-quality training products that are already in existence and translating them to be directly used by wheelchair users, their support systems, and the clinicians providing their care. The second aim is to look at integrating stakeholder feedback throughout pretty much all stages of material development, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the course development. And then the third aim is to create self-assessment versions of some existing outcome measures that look at both transfer technique and the ability to perform maintenance, and using them as educational tools that really enable end users to track their progress and also identify areas that might require further training. The fourth aim looks at disseminating and promoting the utilization of these materials to the end users. And then the final aim is to evaluate how they're being used. So to do that, I'll talk a little bit more later, but we'll be going through focus groups, social media, surveys, and self-assessment to get more into that. Introduce the study team a little bit. So Mike Boninger and I are the PIs from the University of Pittsburgh, and then Cindy Kai is our partner at the American Institutes for Research. There's a strong team from both that sort of extends past that. And then we also have community partners. So the United Spinal Association of Western Pennsylvania, about 65% of individuals with spinal cord injury use a wheelchair as their primary means of mobility. So wheelchair users make up a pretty large portion of this group. And in general, United Spinal Association is committed to sort of sharing resources and expertise, so they make a pretty excellent community partner for us. At the local level, they're also part of a peer support group that we'll be using to integrate stakeholder feedback. The Spina Bifida Association of Western Pennsylvania is another local partner. We're working with them currently on some training programs, and they have strong ties with organizations that provide services to individuals with disability throughout the area, as well as their national association. And then the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center provides us access to the clinicians that are providing care for some of these individuals, so they'll serve as sort of another gatekeeper to gaining access to the end users. This slide is mainly just to highlight the role that stakeholder input is going to play throughout our entire KT process. So the core of our project team includes stakeholders. So even from the start of material development, we have end users contributing process, and then we'll continue to collect additional input from those external to the project team when we pilot our courses, as well as once the courses are live. So a little bit about the course development. We're developing an interactive training course, one for transfers and one for maintenance, and the course development scheme will sort of be the same for both. The course itself will include material presented in a lot of different manners: text, video, pictures, quizzes, self-assessments. These self-assessments are converted from existing outcome measures. And then once we have those together, we'll be piloting the course to a closed group. And sort of in parallel to developing the course training, we'll also be developing a social media platform. And we'll be using this as a way that participants can interact and hopefully continue some of the sustainability of this course as time moves on past this grant. We'll also be developing fact sheets in conjunction as accompanying materials that both users and clinicians can use as resources. And then we'll be continually revising our materials based on feedback we gain, both from the pilot as well as once the course is live. For our self-paced course, we're going to be using the self-determination model of learning, mainly because it's been shown to improve self-efficacy among individuals with disabilities. And some of the main portions of this model that we think fit really well with our training is they include individual goal setting based on the user's interests, abilities, and needs. They'll then participate meaningfully in the design of the interventions if we include stakeholders in that. And then as they move through the training, they'll be able to implement strategies that help them modify their own behavior. And we'll also provide them with some different strategies to track their progress to the goal. And then they'll be able to either modify their goal or action plan as they move through the self-paced course. And we feel this construct aligns really well with our KT efforts and building self-efficacy among end users, which is one of the inherent long-term goals of the project. And in terms of reaching our audience, our community partners will be a strong avenue that we'll use to reach partners locally, and then hopefully bridging to national associations to continue to spread the word. Presenting at conferences, both the results of our finding as well as to other clinicians, research groups, anybody that can be interacting with these end users. And then we've identified several means of electronic distribution, so whether it's listservs, email blasts, and social media resources. We've also identified a series of strategies to ensure adoption. So one of the first is reminder emails. So whether it's informative supplements to supplement the trainings or questions or cues for self-assessment, these will encourage our participants to continue to use what they've learned and also provide us with some feedback in terms of behavior modification and any suggestions that they have for us to modify materials. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but print materials. So we'll be developing guides, decision aids, and checklists that users can all use for self-evaluation. And we'll be developing these simultaneously to both support the training and use them as reminders for our audience. They'll also serve as educational resources for therapists. And we'll be encouraging users to contact members of their existing clinical team if problems arise during the training. We'll also use some mini quizzes and sort of self-assessments that will help test users' understanding, reinforce important concepts, and let users track their progress. The user satisfaction surveys will help sort of inform how we modify the content as the course moves forward. And then the public social media sites There'll be a facilitator from the University of Pittsburgh that's a content expert in the area. So questions that users have as they're going through the training, other things that weren't covered in the training that they'd like to talk about, and sort of monitoring each other's responses will be the role of the facilitator. And then we'll also have discussion boards that will really encourage users to interact with each other, give each other feedback on transfers, maintenance, provide suggestions, and sort of that teaching what you've learned will help reinforce some of the things that we've covered in the training. In terms of data collection measures, one thing that we'll be doing is tracking usage. So Google Analytics will provide us with the opportunity to look at both website usage, the most and least popular content, and the types of users that we're attracting that can really inform how we refine our materials. And then web-based survey instruments will be used to collect data on the knowledge that our stakeholders have, their opinions, their awareness of different topics that we're covering, as well as the demand for and use of the different aspects of the training on our website. We'll also be conducting individual interviews and focus groups primarily during the pilot testing phase of our project. And the goal of these is really to gather some in-depth information on special topics of interest to the evaluation. Like we might use telephone interviews to explore how users are using our trainings or how the products have impacted them in accessing their community. To gather feedback, we'll also be using some self-administered questionnaires, and then the follow-up emails may include some satisfaction surveys. So this data collection is starting in year 1 of our process, and it's really going to guide the iterative design and the strategies that we use to disseminate and utilize our training programs. So overall, our knowledge synthesis will start with existing evidence-based content that's been developed by the University of Pittsburgh, and we'll disseminate some of the existing outcome measures for use by clinicians and also translate them to self-assessments that can be used by users with training targets. The users will provide us with feedback through the pilot, and then we'll work together to disseminate these completed courses through our community partners and social media. So we're pretty confident that these will help us in our long-term results of both achieving better maintained wheelchairs and improving transfer techniques. And then that's sort of what I have, Kathleen, in terms of a summary of our project.
Thanks, Lynn. Well, there's a lot of useful information that's going to come out of that project, and it's so relevant, obviously, to the everyday life of so many people in the audience. So we appreciate all the thought that's going into it. Next up, we will hear from Marcia Langer-Ellison. You all set, Marcia?
Yes, I am. Thank you. So I'm very happy to describe to you our project. Acronym is TEST, Translating Evidence to Support Transitions, Improving the Outcomes of Youth in Transition with Psychiatric Disabilities by Use and Adoption of Best Practice Transition Planning. So that's a long title. Just briefly, our acknowledgments. This project is being conducted by the Transitions Research and Training Center at the UMass Medical School. We are funded by NIDILRR, as you all know, and also co-funded by SAMHSA. Our mission is to improve the supports for youth and young adults aged 14 to 30 with serious mental health conditions who are trying to complete their schooling and training and move into rewarding work lives. Before I launch into describing TEST to you, I spend a moment describing what this is. Many of you know that youth and young adults who are in special education services in high school have deplorable outcomes in terms of their employment and education when they come out of high school, both relative to other disability groups and to the general population. Special education has a transition planning effort that has been legislated and is in place and has been very helpful for many disability groups to improve their transition from secondary schooling to post-secondary employment or education. But these transition planning efforts have not been tailored to those youth with psychiatric disabilities. And that's really what this project was all about. So our efforts here, these are four broad efforts. The first is to develop research-informed knowledge translation materials and procedures tailored to youth with emotional behavioral disturbance. And then to pilot test the procedures and materials, to implement them and provide technical assistance to a targeted state to adopt test. And I'll be describing what a targeted state is. And then to disseminate tests at a national institute that is run by one of our partners, Intact, which I will also describe. So our partners, the UMass team is myself. I am the PI. Kate Biebel from UMass is co-PI. Sloan Huckabee is our postdoctoral fellow who will be taking a large role in this project, and Laura Golden is our research assistant. Other partners are Mary Wagner from SRI and the Transition Alliance of South Carolina, Intact, and Joanne Starks from KTER and AIR is also a consultant to our project. Next slide, and I'll be describing who these people are a little bit more. So first of all, we are couching our effort in NIDILRR-funded research findings, which was we understood to be essential to the success of this application. That there were research findings that were ready to be adopted and used. These are three research findings. Next slide that I'll describe a little bit that guided our whole effort. So these findings were developed by Mary Wagner at SRI. You may be familiar with the National Longitudinal Transition Study. Next slide. And NLTS2 was a longitudinal study of youth with disabilities in transition from high school to several years post-high school. And we were contracted with Mary Wagner to analyze post-secondary outcomes specific to students with psychiatric disabilities to understand what predicted better outcomes. And so there were three that stood out clearly as factors that are malleable and open to being able to be adopted and used in other transition teams. So one of these was, I think it won't be remarkable to this audience, but it is still remarkable to the larger special education audience, that those students who had received instruction in high school on the purpose and processes of transition planning and how to actively participate in them were more significantly likely to obtain full-time employment after high school. So this is really about self-determination and self-advocacy in the IEP transition planning team for the youth with disabilities. And that had a direct predictive effect on employment after high school. The second finding was the effects of taking any general education and a CTE concentration on full-time employment. So CTE is career and technical education, and the concentration is earning 4 or more credits. So a high school student who has at least 4 credits in a career development class and a concentration about careers, specific career training and employment training in high school, were more likely to have full-time employment 2 years and 8 years post-high school. And so the importance of that kind of career and technical education in high school was evident. So we had those findings, and we applied the NIDILRR stage-based implementation framework to our to this project. That's the National Implementation Research Network, and they have this stage model of implementation science, where you first, looking across the top, you need to explore the context of where you're trying to implement your, whatever practice you're trying to disseminate. The next phase in the green is installation. You actually put it into place. It essentially is a pilot, and these are the various on the rows are the various things that are needed in order to have a successful exploration and installation. You need an implementation team, data and feedback, the team, and the feedback loops. There's initial implementation, you try it out, and full implementation at the end. And so we use this framework to structure how we were going to develop these findings into practices that can be adopted and used by transition teams nationally. So there were 3 objectives here. First, we wanted to develop the products. That was objective 1. And then to pilot test them into, and then finally to provide implementation support and intensive technical assistance to a specific state to adopt test. And these are the various steps that related to these 3 objectives. And our 4th objective was having developed it in a particular, with the input of an implementation team, and then pilot tested it in an initial pilot test, and then in a larger pilot test in a particular state with targeted technical assistance. We would then present the results of that at a content session at a National Capacity Building Institute. And then finally, having fully tested the materials, we would go through widespread dissemination through our Research and Training Center. So our partners in South Carolina are the Center for Disability Resources, and within that is the Transition Alliance of South Carolina. So this is a particular local implementation team who are already fully committed and charged with improving transition planning in South Carolina. And they were ready and willing to partner with us to develop the materials and to figure out what are the local needs of educators on the ground and how can we design the materials so that they are accessed by these teams and are ready to be adopted. So a little description about the Transition Alliance. They are housed at the Center for Disability Resources, capacity for serving transition-age youth, and they build this capacity for transition programming at state and local levels. So our intention is to develop the materials with the help of our partners in South Carolina in the first year, and then to actually pilot test it, an initial pilot test with at 3 school districts in South Carolina. And of course, there's evaluation and feedback loops built in so that we refine the materials. Our next step was to then use the organization INTACT. This is the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition that is funded by the Department of Education. And so their activities are to develop evidence-based practices, and then to provide technical assistance at all levels, and then to measure outcomes. So they are already a knowledge translation center, and though funded by the Department of Education, but very well suited to our efforts to use an implementation science framework and to help us move these materials into wider testing and dissemination. So these are the kinds of things that INTACT does for all of the departments of education that affiliate with them. They provide intensive technical assistance to 15 selected states. They are targeted states. That means that based on data that they obtain from the states, their technical assistance is time limited and task specific. And then finally, they provide materials and curricula universally through their website and through webinars and other kinds of guidance on a national level. So they were a very perfect partner for us to scale up our efforts from local, state, and local implementation to a national audience.
Thank you, Marcia. That's really a great example of how to leverage cross-institutional resources. Thanks again to all of our presenters today. To those of you listening, we would really appreciate if you have time to share your thoughts and perceptions about today's webcast by completing our brief online evaluation. It has only 5 short questions. The link is right there at the top of the last page of the PowerPoint file. Everyone who registered will also get an email with a link to this evaluation form, so of course no need to do it twice. The archived audio-video file and a written transcript of the webcast will be available and posted on the webcast page. Okay, so once again, I really want to thank our presenters and all of our colleagues at the KTER Center and AIR for their support. We also, of course, appreciate the support from NIDILRR activities. None of that would happen without NIDILRR. So on this final note, I'd like to conclude today's webcast. We look forward to your participation in our next event. Thank you, and good afternoon.